What's up guys, my name is Ace, and there's a key mode or playlist or mosh pit that I think is absolutely missing from Black Ops 6, and it would be very beneficial to see this, at least for many players out there. And this is a Mercenary mode or a Mercenary mosh pit. Now for those that aren't familiar, Mercenary modes have been around in Call of Duty for quite some time. They were much more popular back in the day. In recent Call of Duties, they may pop up from time to time as limited modes, but they're just not a permanent staple anymore. Which I find to be really unfortunate since back in the day at least, Mercenary was my favorite playlist to play in. But with the Mercenary modes, the key here is only solo players can search for these modes, so you can't party up at all. You can't even play it with one other friend. It's strictly solos only. And this would solve a lot of the issues that many of us are experiencing, especially with Black Ops 6. I feel like this is especially bad in this game relative to some of the other recent Call of Duty games we've seen. Now, just a heads up with this video, this is going to be talking about my personal experiences a lot and my feelings toward the system. I don't have the data to back it up or anything, but it is a topic I feel quite strongly about, and I'm sure many of you out there can relate to a lot of the things I discussed today. So let's talk about some of the issues here with not having a Mercenary mode, especially from the perspective of higher MMR players, or players that are quite good at the game and have a high hidden skill rating. With this, if you are a very skilled player and you search for a match, well, yes, you're likely going to be getting a lobby that's a bit more difficult on average because of the skill-based matchmaking system in Call of Duty. At the end of the day, the system's probably not going to find 11 other players of a similar skill to you if you're a top 1% player, or even like a top 10% player. So as strict as SBMM is, there's still always going to be at least some skill variance in a lobby. So this is where team balancing comes into the equation. And to be clear, team balancing is a good thing. In fact, it's probably a very necessary thing as well to avoid blowouts every single match. But with this, a really common experience with higher skilled solo players is once they get into a match, in order for the teams to be balanced, if they're significantly better than anyone else in the lobby, simply because statistically they're not going to be running into people at their skill level very often at least, what the team balancer has to do is stack most, if not all, of the worst players in the lobby on their team in order to try to balance out the total skill ratings of each team. And at a basic level at least, this makes total sense. You don't want to see too many blowouts. You want to try to have at least reasonably fair back and forth matches more often than not. However, I do think it's a bit flawed in the sense that it doesn't seem to account for the carry potential of a single player, especially when you stack all of the worst players on their team to really anchor them back. I think it puts a little too much expectation on a single player to control the entire match. But the primary point I wanted to get at here is this gets significantly worse the moment parties start entering the equation. Because if there's a party of players in the match with less than 6 players, so they've got room on their team, if you're a higher skilled solo player, you're almost never going to end up on that team with the party. And in my experience, there's always at least some parties in the lobby, even if it's just parties of 2 or 3 players. They're going to be there, and in general, you're going to have the more skilled parties on the opposite team if you're a higher skilled solo player. And this just makes it that much more difficult to properly balance those teams, because obviously you can't put that high skill player with an above average party in the lobby, because then you would stomp way too hard on everybody else in the lobby. So you have to put that higher skill player on the other team. But then what this means is for those higher skilled players, they find themselves consistently playing against parties, and usually decent parties. And it's one of those things where even if that solo player is better than everyone else in the lobby, even by a decent margin, there's only so much a single player can do if they're stacked with all of the worst players on their team in a team-based mode where you have to have at least some reliance on teammates, at least in most game modes. I mean, Team Deathmatch is one exception where you can kind of just do your own thing. But even then, when you factor score streaks into the equation, if the rest of your team is just running into gunfire and just feeding the enemy team streak after streak after streak, it makes it that much more difficult to carry as a solo player. And that's why I think this is the biggest issue, is mixing parties into the equation. It throws this entire system off, because at that point it becomes very difficult to not only balance the total skill rating on both teams, because they obviously can't split that party up to get a proper balance, but also it doesn't seem to properly account for the carry potential of a single solo player. And this just gets incredibly frustrating. If you're somebody that prefers to play solo and you happen to be a skilled player, you probably run into this all the time, more often than not. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to this. Sometimes you will get that nice freebie of a game where it's not so bad, but more often than not, my experience playing solo is I feel like if I'm not giving it 110% and using meta weapons, my team is going to get absolutely destroyed. Like, we have zero shot of winning, and the only chance we have of maybe winning a game is if I'm giving it my all and using the best guns. And I really don't mind having to carry from time to time, but it gets frustrating with how consistent this is, having the weight of the entire match on your shoulders. It can get really tiresome and frustrating to just constantly feel like if you're not playing at your best, you're letting down your entire team. Now, I have seen the argument every time I bring this up, people say, well, you don't have to play at 100%. Because if you just play poorly for a few matches, your MMR will adjust, and then you'll get easier lobbies, or more favorable team balancing at least. And then at that point, you have the ability to perform okay with your off-meta weapons that you've been using for a few games and getting destroyed with. My issue with this is it basically just feels like reverse boosting, even though it's like soft reverse boosting because you're not dying intentionally, but you're also basically throwing the game, not only for yourself, but also for your team, because the team balancing system, when placing you into those lobbies, has a certain expectation of you to be able to carry based on your MMR. And if you're not playing to that potential, then the entire match falls apart because the entire weight of that match was placed on your shoulders alone. And with all of this combined, this is the biggest reason that I'm almost always playing in a party now. You guys might have noticed in my gameplays, I'm almost always partied up. And usually what I do is I'll just be live streaming on Twitch, and I just open up the lobby, and it's first come, first serve. Anybody can join, any skill level, doesn't matter. You could be a really good player, really bad player, average player, doesn't matter. Everybody's welcome. And obviously part of this is I like interacting with the community. I like giving people the opportunity to play with me. I think it's fun to do that. But I'd also be lying if I said I wasn't doing this, at least to a degree, to get a more laid-back experience where the team balancing system can't be placing all of the worst players on my team. So this has been a viable solution for me, and it's just something that I've adapted to over time after recognizing how bad this has gotten, especially as the matchmaking has become more strict, and I've noticed I'm running into more parties more often, and more skilled parties more often. I kind of felt like I had to do this to have a decent experience on a fairly consistent basis, but it comes with its own problems as well. When you party up like this, one big thing I run into is it can often get boring because, especially with people leaving as much as they do now, as I mentioned earlier, this often just leads to matches where it's 6v2 and you're basically just trying to predict where the next guy is spawning so you can beat your teammate to that kill. You're not actually playing the game. There's no back and forth there. There's no real competition or tension. You're just destroying them. And it's really hard to get that perfect balance where if you play solo, you get destroyed or have to perform exceptionally well just to keep your head above the water, or you party up and now it's way too easy to the point where it's just boring. Additionally, since parties are creating many of the issues with having balanced matches, at least in my opinion, what I find this does is it encourages people to party up like I do now, which just feeds into the issue more because now there's more parties and it just creates more issues with trying to properly balance matches. And that's unfortunate because for me, for instance, I generally prefer, or at least I used to prefer, playing solo in COD. I really like the challenge of that. But now I feel like I have to party up for a better experience. But me partying up makes the experience worse for any solo players that we end up playing against when I'm partied up and they just end up leaving. And it's just a horrible cycle that we get into. And with all of this combined, this is exactly why a mercenary mode would be such a great addition, in my opinion. And honestly, not even just for the skilled players. I know I've been talking about this primarily from the perspective of a skilled solo player, but even for unskilled solo players, it sucks when you're placed on the team with that high skilled solo player, and you're basically just the cannon fodder for the other team in order to try to bring balance to that high skilled solo player in your lobby. So you can't really compete super well against the other team, especially when they're partied up and this happens. So I think the lack of a mercenary mode can create a horrible experience for any solo players out there, regardless of your skill rating. Whereas with mercenary modes, the thing I've always loved about them in the past, and the reason that I would always gravitate toward mercenary modes, is the moment you eliminate parties from the equation, the team balancer is actually pretty great. From what I remember, it almost always created a good mix of player skill levels on both teams. So both teams would generally have their skilled player at the top, then there'd be a bunch of average players on both teams, and then some below average players on both teams. So there's a little bit of something for everybody. If you're a low skill player, well, there's gonna be some low skill players on the other team as well. And from the perspective of a high skill player, I always found it to be very enjoyable to have that rival on the other team who is the next best in the lobby, or maybe they were a little better than you. And I often found back in the day, like I'm thinking back to Black Ops 2 where I played a ton of mercenary modes, the experience was pretty consistently me and the other top player from the other team fighting to see who could carry their team the best. And there generally weren't crazy blowouts one way or the other, it was usually fairly neck and neck in my experience. And I also found with that, the games rarely devolved into straight up spawn trapping super heavily, or the majority of one team leaving the match because they're just getting stomped so hard, and that just makes the issue worse. It was a lot of back and forth right down to the end of the game, and it was the most consistently enjoyable experience I can remember playing with Call of Duty. And I really want to see that return, especially with Black Ops 6. Now I realize anytime you're asking for new modes or playlists, you can't be fragmenting the player base too much. I think in an ideal world, it'd be amazing to have a totally separate tab of playlists where you could select individual game modes and it was all Mercenary, so solos only, but that's probably not realistic since it would fragment the player base too much. So at the very least, the thing I would absolutely love to see is just a Mercenary mosh pit mode, ideally as a permanent solution, assuming it would attract enough players and be popular enough. So with this, I'd like to see a mosh pit of like team deathmatch, kill confirm, domination, and maybe hardpoint could be thrown in there as well. If they were to bring this, I would absolutely play this quite often. Sorry to my viewers out there that like to party up with me on stream. I would be playing with you guys a little bit less, although I'd make sure I still do some open lobbies where I do play with my viewers. But I would love to play a solo experience in Black Ops 6 where the team balancing algorithm can work as effectively as possible. So that's my big plea to the developers today. Please try out a Mercenary mosh pit playlist in Black Ops 6. Also, don't hide it way at the bottom of the playlist filters. Like, put it front and center, at least to begin with, so it gets a proper chance of getting some traction from the players that don't scroll all the way down on the playlist. And if they were to do this, I think it would make for a much better experience overall for anybody that likes playing solo. Now, of course, these are all just my thoughts and experiences and hopes for the future, and this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How would you feel about having the option to have a Mercenary mode in Black Ops 6? Is it something you would actively seek out and play? Or maybe not? Are you just always in a party and you have no interest in that? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.